a special guest this morning, Heather Sigler, one of the original and youngest, she's told Marilyn, the youngest charter member of Christ Presbyterian Church. It's going to be a walk back through memory lane. She's a retired pastor, most recently the parish associate at Pine Street. So I want to also remind you that in 2 weeks we have Amy Gross coming from West Shore School District to talk about the needs of the kids and the impact of Project Ask, which our own Marcy Irvin has been supporting for years. And then in 2 weeks, Vida David is coming. She's going to talk to us about the current status of the Presbyterian Education Board in Pakistan. It's wonderful to have her back. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Heather and let's enjoy.
Developing a new church took a lot more than what it does today. The first thing that happened was there were surveys done by the denomination and by the Harrisburg Council of Churches. We had to be sure we weren't stepping on anybody else's toes. If we established a new church in this area, who would be concerned about that? Well, the folks maybe at Grace Lutheran, how did they feel about having a new Presbyterian church in their backyard? So that there were a number of surveys done by both our denomination and by the United Churches, the area, to establish that, yes, it would be okay to have a church here. So it took 3 years to get all of the approvals, and the denomination gave us a pastor. By the summer of 1956, the pastor was moving in, had been called. We had no idea about this at this point. The presbytery, the synod, and the denomination were doing all the arranging. I fell into this in the summer of 1956. What you have to appreciate is that in the summer of 1956, I was 13 years old. My family was a member of Pine Street. I had gone through the Pine Street confirmation class that spring. I had made my profession of faith. I had joined the church, so that as the new church developed, I was able to participate as an adult member who I could sign the charter list myself because I was joining by letter of transfer. But I first ran into this in the summer of 1956, months before this was even announced to the community. The denomination at that point sponsored a number of summer programs, and one of them was an educational program at Wilson College. My mother taught in it for a number of years, doing lab demonstrations for how to teach kindergarten and preschool children. And we went as a family every year, and they put kids into classrooms and then people watched. It was kind of an interesting process. But that summer, all of the offerings from the Wilson College educational programs were designated for Bibles for a new church somewhere in the presbytery or somewhere in the synod. We had no idea where, but we took up the offering every week, and we were told every week that it was for Bibles for a newly organizing church. I came home from Wilson College in July and didn't give it any more thought. And then the end of August, I had a phone call from a woman named Ruth Wardlaw. Keep that name in your mind. It will come back to us in the history of the church. Ruth Wardlaw was an educational consultant for the synod and worked out of the Payne Shoemaker building in Harrisburg. Ruth called and wanted to talk to me. My mother thought this was a bit strange because Ruth and my mother often did education events together. But I got on the phone with Ruth and she said, "Do you remember the offerings from Wilson College and what they were for?" I said, "Yeah, they were for Bibles for a new church." She said, "Well, the new church is going to be in your neighborhood. The new pastor has moved in and he lives 2 blocks away from you. And would you go with me to deliver the Bibles? They're in the trunk of my car." Okay, a 13-year-old on an August day, it sounded like a fun thing to do. Ruth picked me up and we went 2 blocks away up Carlisle Road to 1609 Carlisle Road, which is directly across the street from Grace Lutheran Church. The pastor had moved in. John Sensenig helped us unload the Bibles and pile them in his living room. There was no church office at that point. It was his living room. And then he invited us to sit down and talk. And he told us, this was the end of August, that he had everything ready for the opening of this new church, the beginning of November, except for one thing. He did not have a kindergarten teacher. I opened my big mouth and I said, oh, my mother's a kindergarten teacher and Ruth knows my mother. They do education events together for the Synod. Maybe mother could help you find a kindergarten teacher. Well, we sat and finished the conversation, and one of the things he said that they had all lined up was they had a music program ready to go. We had a choir director, we had an organist. Did I want to sing in the first choir? I would be welcome in the first choir. So he gave me information and I thanked him. And Ruth took me home, drove 2 blocks back down Carlisle Road. And when I went in, my mother was on the phone, and guess who she was talking to? Jack Sensenig must have called her before the door closed behind us. Mother said, well, I'm the superintendent of the kindergarten program at Pine Street. We've got 40 or 50 kids on the kindergarten roll. I don't know. This may not be what I want to do right now. But she agreed to think about it. She called him, and we talked about it at dinner that night, and it was kind of an interesting idea. What mother wound up doing was telling Jack Sensenig that indeed she would help him organize his kindergarten program and his preschool programs. Pine Street was, they were doing this by rote. They did it every year. They knew what they were doing. They simply the teachers had their fall meeting. Everything was ready to fly. And she said, I'll stick with you through Christmas and get you through the holidays and through Advent and get your teachers trained so that they know how to use the curriculum. And then we'll go back to Pine Street. So that was our expectation as the new church opened on the first Sunday of November in 1956 in Highland Elementary School. And so that was my introduction to this new church, and the fact that it was going to be not in my backyard, but literally in my front yard. For those of you who don't know where I grew up at 1304 Carlisle Road. And if you've been driving back and forth on Carlisle Road, across from Highland Elementary School, there is a house that is being completely transformed by a bunch of builders. There are always trucks in the yard. It now has a new roof. That was my childhood home. So the church was right across the street. So that was how I first got involved. Meeting in the school was an interesting process. It was the old school building. It's not the one that's there now. It was another building, and it was built in 3 sections. There was a front area with a cafeteria and office spaces. Then there were 2 long glass hallways and another section of classrooms, and 2 more glass hallways and a 3rd section of classrooms. So we did okay with that, but what happened was we had to rearrange the whole school when we went in on Sunday morning. And it was to change classrooms from day school to church school, to change the cafeteria into a worship space. It took a lot of energy and work. To change the kindergarten room, I'm sure you've all looked in the windows. If you haven't had kindergarten children, you know what a kindergarten classroom looks like. It's got a lot of toys and blocks and a lot of things that at that point would not have been in a 1st grade classroom. So First thing we needed to do in the classroom was push all the desks to one side. There was a large rug that was stored in a closet off the main cafeteria area. The rug was brought in and opened. There were housekeeping units, little toy sinks and stoves and tables and chairs that were brought in. There was a book center. The blocks were brought. Everything was stored in a closet in the auditorium area and brought into the Sunday school room. Every Sunday school room did the same thing. We had to convert a classroom with chairs and tables lined up into a Sunday school room. It took effort, took time to get everything done, because my mother insisted that they were going to do it right. They weren't going to shortchange anyone. If the lesson called for painting with poster paints, they were going to paint with poster paints. And so we had to be careful of the teachers' materials that were there from during the week, moving our things back and forth. At the end of the class, we had to do exactly the same thing, except in reverse. The rug was rolled up and put back in the closet. All of the toys and games and pieces were put back. Desks were, we had a chart for the desks. The teacher, the classroom teacher during the week had numbered the desks. So we were really pretty good on knowing how to get everything back in order for that particular teacher. Actually, I said it was a first grade classroom. It wasn't. It was a second grade classroom. And you will probably all know whose second grade classroom it was. The classroom at the time belonged to Tassie Over. Joe Over and Tassie were members of this congregation for a long time. But it was her classroom that we set up for a kindergarten. In the cafeteria area, there were tables like this. Kids ate lunch in the cafeteria. We had to clear all of that out, set up the chairs, folding chairs, turn it into worship space. There was a small stage. On the stage, they made us 2 modesty screens for either side, since we were going to put a choir up there. We had 2 modesty screens. We had a center pulpit, a communion table, and the missing element was an organ. The organ came every Sunday from Ray's Music House. The Rays were also members of the church eventually, but the organ was trucked in every Sunday morning, and a group of men would meet the truck in front of the school, haul the organ on a little wheeled platform in, and get it set up so that we could have an electric organ for worship. Eventually, we made a deal with the school that we could store the organ there, and they would have the privilege of using it for their programs. But that didn't happen right away. There was a choir, and indeed I sang with it on the first Sunday. And I could even tell you what we sang. Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence was our introit. And the anthem was a thing that had a phrase in it, walk with me, brother, hand in hand. I don't remember the words, all the words, but it was an interesting time. We had, and the choir director was, her last name was Nace. I want to say Jenny Nace. Does that sound right? And a woman by the name of Mrs. Calaman was the organist. So we got off to a flying start in the church, and it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of hard work. Stop there a minute. I'm going to skim my notes to see if I skipped anything in my beginning of this. The new church. Oh, we did rent the school for special events. We had a family night the first Sunday of every month. That was, we needed to get to know each other. We were coming from different places. We were not a congregation. We were a group of people who wanted to come together and be a congregation. So we did have very nice family nights. And by the time the 3 months were passed that the McLaughlin family had agreed to work with the new church, there was no going back to Pine Street. 3 months with a newly organizing congregation with the energy and the enthusiasm and working together on so many different projects. The only time we ever went back was for candlelight Christmas Eve service because we did not have one of those in the school. So we threw our lot in with the new church, and I think we were always very happy we did. I have no particular idea of how that came about. That was in place by the time we first met Jack Sensenig, so that was done by the folks who from the denomination who were setting this all up. It certainly was a good meeting place for us, and it was the land was purchased up front, which is kind of unusual. We think now that the congregation would get together and decide where they wanted to go. No, the land was purchased. We purchased, I want to say it's 4 acres. The original purchase was 4 acres. I don't know if anything's been added to it since that or not. Do you want to guess how much we paid for those 4 acres? $22,000. Yeah, I was kind of surprised at that. In talking about worship, I have a gift for the congregation. Every so often, my mother would get a phone call from Jack Sensenig. And the phone call was, bring your silver bowl tomorrow. I'm baptizing someone. Well, here's the silver bowl. Oh, we're switching again. Sorry, folks. Yeah. Okay. Jack would ask Mother to bring her silver bowl. I found the silver bowl in cleaning out my mother and brother's home. Mother always wondered how many children and adults who had been baptized in this bowl. It was used for every baptism until we came into this building. If anybody likes research and would like to figure that out, I'm sure the section records would have that in it. We have a record of people baptized. I would like to give you this bowl because I have nothing to do with it at home. Put it with your archives. You now have the church's original baptism font. Not yet. Not yet. That'll come. Oh, I was still thinking about worship. The congregation needs hymnals, talking about setting up the room for worship. Once we got the tables out of the way and the chairs set up, hymnals. The closet where the Sunday school materials were stored was at one end of the building. The closet where the hymnals was stored at the other end. They invited people who were coming in the front door to take a handful of hymnals and please put them on some of the chairs or pass the hymnals out as people came into worship. After Sunday worship, we had to gather up all these hymnals and put them back in the closet. My dad thought this was very labor intensive and there had to be a better way to do it. He built a wagon and put steep sides on the wagon. The Bibles were stacked in the wagon, pulled through the aisles, put a big Bible in the chair, and project was done. I have no idea where the wagon went, but we did solve the problem and made it much easier to distribute hymnals. I don't remember Christmas the first year in the church. I don't know why I don't remember Christmas, but I don't. I do remember our first Easter. The first Easter was here in the cornfield. There are a lot of photographs of that around because my dad took most of them. But we do have a lot of photographs of Easter in the cornfield. The second year, we also tried to hold an Easter sunrise service in the cornfield, and it poured. Heavy, steady downpour. Dad had picked up several dozen donuts that were to be eaten after the sunrise service. He carried them across the street to Highland Elementary School, where Jack Sensenegg was standing at the door in this pouring rain saying, "This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." And we're saying, take the dang donuts. That service was memorable. It'd be memorable because it didn't happen. The congregation began meeting and talk about naming the church. I remember attending a number of meetings, but the one where I remember the meeting itself was the meeting to name the church. We were doing two things at that meeting. We were going to name the church and we were going to approve the first slate of officers. We couldn't elect officers yet because we weren't constituted as a church. So these are things that had to be done up front so that they could go to the organizational meeting and confirm then when there was a congregation. There were really two names suggested for the church. The first one was a geographic name, and they couldn't determine which they wanted. Okay, it doesn't want to clip where you want me to clip. That's okay. I'll get it. I'll put it on my lapel. No, it's okay. In fact, it's better this way. This is what I do at church occasionally. The first suggestion was a geographic name, that this should be the Highland Park Presbyterian Church, the Cedar Cliff Presbyterian Church. Allendale wasn't a place yet. It was barely marked off. They hadn't begun building back here. West Shore Presbyterian Church. There was a group of potential members who really thought that that was the way to go. It had to be a geographic church to differentiate it from the Camp Hill Presbyterian Church, since all of these addresses were Camp Hill addresses. Well, we realized very early on that there were going to be people here from New Cumberland, Lemoyne, Lewisberry. This was going to be a regional church. It was not going to serve one specific location. So that group was going to argue for a geographic name. The second group wanted to argue for St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church had a lot of theological backing, because if you remember, Andrew the disciple is the one who goes and brings his brother to meet Jesus. And the feeling was this was going to be a congregation with substantial outreach, that we were going to be bringing people in from the surrounding communities, that we should be St. Andrew's Church. Well, they argued back and forth. The argument against St. Andrew's was that there was already a St. Andrew's Church in our presbytery in Lebanon. So they argued back and forth as to geographic name and St. Andrew's. Finally, one gentleman in the congregation, and I was recently told who that gentleman was, and I think I forgot it. At least I'm thinking it was the man, tall, slim guy who always hung around the front door and welcomed people. We have a great greeter. Who am I thinking of? Who? Could be. So someone recently, when I was down here for a memorial service, said, "Oh, I know who that was," and gave me a name. I'm not sure at the moment, but at any rate, one man stood up and he said, "I've got a name you can't argue with, which should be Christ Presbyterian Church." Everyone looked at him and said, "That's a good idea. Okay, let's vote." It went down just about that easily once somebody made a third suggestion. But they spent an awful lot of time debating the first two options. So anyway, that's how the church got its name. Ed. As what? Yes.
Just a reminder for everyone in the room, people on Zoom cannot hear you without
Yes,
using the
you have to
microphone.
use your outside voice.
Well, either that or you'll need to, or maybe Heather, maybe it would be better if you just repeated the question.
The question, it wasn't so much a question as a statement that we had united in our name at one time, that the corporate name. But for all practical purposes, we were simply Christ Presbyterian Church and continued that way. Couple other, I want to say a couple words about our first pastor. Jack Sensenig was a truly unique guy. They chose well when they sent him to us. He came with a wife and 4 children. They were probably at the time that he first moved in. I know that Mary was only 4 years old. The youngest was 4. They were probably 4, 6, 8, and 11-ish, because the one was the age of my brother. The older one was the age of my brother. David, Mark, Michael, and Mary. I always felt sorry for David. He had a D and the rest were M's. Mark, Michael, and Mary. Well, he moved in with this family and the kids were delightful. Edna was right in with us, his wife, until she became very ill in the second year that the church existed. She was hospitalized and the children were farmed out to various members of the congregation. David stayed with us because he was the age of my brother. The other children were staying in various homes of the congregation and Edna was in the hospital. On Saturday morning of the week they were there, Jack called and said that he and one of the elders were coming to the house to talk to David. Edna had died overnight. So here is a new church, a pastor who's been here less than 2 years, left with 4 little kids. He made do with housekeepers, live-in housekeepers, and things went, the congregation was unbelievably supportive of that. I said, remember the name Ruth Wardlaw. Edna died sometime in, I want to say, late spring of the second year of the church. I don't think the kids were in school. Maybe it was early summer. But at Christmas, this woman, Ruth Wardlaw, who both my mother and I knew fairly well, showed up in the church for our Christmas service. And Mother, I don't know where Ruth normally worshiped, but it wasn't with us. And Mother said to her, "Oh, what brings you out tonight, Ruth?" And Ruth said, "I have a date with your pastor." Ruth was brave enough to take on these 4 children. She had never been married. She didn't have children. She stepped right in seamlessly. The family was together, retired in Florida. I kept in touch with Jack over the years. We had a crazy relationship. It started when I was moderator of the youth fellowship by the time I was in high school. And then we were in this building. We would do terrible things to his office. Oh, when the kids were in here Sunday night for youth fellowship, if I would have been Jack, I'd have been afraid to come in the next morning. We would decorate his office. We would leave strange things on his door. But he was just very good to work with, and the congregation called him then as their first pastor. Let's see what else I was going to. Groundbreaking for the church. It's interesting. You see pictures of groundbreaking and you see 4 or 5 people with shovels getting ready to turn over the first spade of dirt. We were invited to bring our own shovels so that everyone participated in the groundbreaking. Bring your own shovel and break ground for the church. And we did that in 1958, 2 years after the church had been organized. The next significant event was laying the cornerstone. And I was going to go look this morning and forgot to see if the cornerstone in this building is exposed. I don't know if it is or not. It's by the front door. Okay. I would have said it was out here somewhere, but then that's probably by the front door. I had the privilege of placing in the cornerstone a list of the Sunday school students and the youth fellowship participants. So that was a really nice event. The first service in this building was Easter Sunday, 1959. And what is memorable about that, for some reason, my brother and I were asked to sing a duet. Now, my brother had a very nice voice. My brother was okay singing. In fact, he probably had, in terms of musical quality, a better voice than I. But I was terrified. He's 5 years younger than I am. I was a senior in high school. And his favorite thing was to embarrass me, and I was sure he wasn't going to open his mouth. And that I was going to be left standing there all by myself. Fortunately, he sang and we got through our little song and all was well. The first unit of the building, which goes down this way and ends, I guess, after the next set of rooms. It ends before your offices. The first unit was dedicated in May of 1959. And my mother kept a wonderful file on the church. She has everything. Someone, Nancy Reinhardt, asked me just a couple of weeks ago if I knew anything about why the church was in the round or what happened to cause that. What I do know is that originally all of the architect's drawings had a standard oblong sanctuary. And if you want to pass these around, if you haven't seen this, they're the same. I'm going to start one on the other side. How we got a church in the round, I'm not sure. But the original drawings had an oblong building, very typical. I have an interesting detail that I learned years later. I said I continued to have a correspondence with Jack Sensenig. The little room across the hall, almost directly across from where Ed's walking out the door now, that is a nursery, looks like maybe a nursery. Sometimes it's looked like a storage room. It is very tiny. I learned why it's very tiny. When they met with the architect, my mother and Jack were meeting with the architect to review the plans for the preschool rooms. And mother said the kindergarten room was too small. If they wanted to have a day school, which as soon as the building was built, they had agreed they were going to open a day school. If they wanted to have a day school, they were going to need more square footage than they had because they weren't in line with state regs. So mother told them how much more they needed to add to the kindergarten room to make that happen. And the architect didn't want to do it. But Jack said he took the drawings home and spread them out on his table. And that night he simply erased a line and moved it 24 inches. So the kindergarten room got an extra 2 feet and that little space lost 2 feet, which is why you have one very tiny room. And you've probably wondered who on earth designed that and why it was so small. It was a little larger in the beginning, but they took some land from it so that the day school could exist. I think that's about all that I managed to write notes about. What would you like to talk about? catches your imagination?